immigration reform and to make sure that we can address these local concerns for communities that are receiving large numbers of immigrants. And with that, I'll yield back and hold for the second round.
I think the gentlelady from New Mexico, the gentleman from the great state of Arkansas, the chair of the main committee, Ms. Westerman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And I would like to talk a bit more about how this process of leasing national park land for a migrant camp circumvented the rules for political purposes. This is something that we've seen time and time again from the Biden administration. If you read the lease signed between the National Park Service and the City of New York, it correctly identifies Floyd Bennett Field as historic property. Now, here's where things get interesting. Instead of the typical Section 106 process, which often involves an extensive review process, it appears it has been waived. Rather, the lease refers to memo signed by Director Sams that notes that City will make upgrades and improvements to the historic area once the lease expires. Now, this is an interesting turn of events. Essentially, there's no guarantee that either construction nor the existence of the migrant camp will not endanger the historic area, something that would generally be required. Instead, the Park Service is accepting a promise of future payments for improvements to the area. Basically, they're accepting a payoff for the lease. Now, I would like to know more if this is the norm for the Biden administration these days, but those decision makers don't always want to answer questions in a public setting. I'm adding both a copy of the lease agreement and memo for the record. Now, to get to my question, in a typical process, a lease for historic property on federal land would involve some level of public engagement. So, Mr. Williams, to your knowledge, or Ms. Williams, excuse me, to your knowledge, did the National Park Service or any other federal agency consult and coordinate with any historic preservation office or council before leasing historic Floyd Bennett Field to be used as a migrant camp?
To answer your question, which was similar to an earlier question, there was no communication with us or the residents of South Brooklyn and Queens, or any type of historic entity whatsoever.
But did the National Park Service or any other federal agency transparently provide the public information about how establishing a migrant encampment would impact Floyd Bennett Field's historic property?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Did the National Park Service or any other federal agency transparently provide the public information about how establishing a migrant encampment would impact Floyd Bennett Field's historic property?
Absolutely none.
And did the Park Service or any other federal agency seek public comment or even input from local elected officials prior to signing the lease with the city?
Negative. There was no such communication at any time.
So they basically just ramrodded this through and avoided any kind of, or sidestepped any kind of normal process. And I can tell you, I know the answer to that because they did. And that's why we continually bring this subject up, is because if they will do this at Floyd Bennett Field, where else will they do it? And, an administration that talks about protecting public assets, protecting the environment, never wavering on any kind of environmental permitting, it seems ironic that they would just magically wave the magic baton, which essentially has to come from President Biden at that level to, and what it looks like they did was declared an emergency so they could waive all permitting and public input and review processes to push this agenda and to provide this migrant camp on federal land. I can tell you when this Congress started, this was the furthest thing from my mind that this committee would have to deal with, that this administration would go onto Park Service land, waive every rule, and build a migrant camp. Can you describe how shocking that was to you, being a resident? Was this something you ever expected to happen?
Definitely no, and to the bigger picture that I do represent 137,000 plus people in my district, and I did have to answer to them. So with not having that communication was very disrespectful to our residents, to our community, and you know, we know what's happening. It's a national crisis, and we understand that. But when there is lack of communication, what we're seeing right now, when we were here before 9 months ago, we're seeing that our community, South Brooklyn and Queens, have become benefactors of a national crisis.
And have you had any communication on whether, with the federal agencies, on whether they will renew the lease in September?
Well, that's why we're here, to plead before you, and we will continue to do so, asking them to please not renew that lease, because if we want to think of humane, these people, let's think of a more dignified, humane way where these people can have a life and not be able to live in such an area. And we can compare this to Orchard Beach, that was in the Bronx, right? The tents were put up, it was susceptible to flooding, you know, lack of access to transportation. This is no different from Floyd Bennett Field, and they did remove those tents. So, you know, we need to treat people with some type of dignity.
And the point being, Representative, is that you're asking, but they're not making any outreach to you to give you assurances or to answer questions or tell you what their plans are.
There's no transparency.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.